Our next speaker is Antony Penrose, of course, the son of Lee Miller, the only child that she bore. He's going to speak on the subject of Man Ray, the Magic Man. Tony's been a fantastic collaborator for this project. Many of the works that you'll see in the exhibition come from the Lee Miller archives and from the Penrose family collection, and we're tremendously grateful to him for lending these works to make the exhibition possible. He is the director of the Lee Miller archives in the Penrose collection, and he's been working on the conservation and dissemination of his parents' work for almost 30 years, at the time that has elapsed since they both died. He began by writing his mother's biography, titled The Lives of Lee Miller from 1995, and then he edited Lee Miller's War in 2005. He wrote a memoir of his father titled Roland Penrose, The Friendly Surrealist. That was published in 2001. Followed by a book about his parents and their lives together at Farley Farm in Sussex, the home of the surrealists. That works from 2008, in which he shares what it was like growing up with them amongst their surrealist friends. His most recent work is an autobiographical children's book, The Boy Who Bit Picasso, from 2011. That will be available to all of you after today's events, and Tony will actually be signing that book for you if you wish to purchase a copy in our bookstore. He's also written and produced an award-winning play, The Angel and the Fiend, based on Lee Miller's life. And in fact, interestingly enough, a feature film based on his book, The Lives of Lee Miller, is planned for release in 2014. Please join me in welcoming Antony Penrose.
Hi. Thanks for not starting without me. My dad, Roland Penrose, knew Man Ray long before Lee Miller did. And just after Man Ray died, he made this rather beautiful lithograph. The title is Homage to Man Ray, and it's brilliantly clever. The lens, you see, is a postcard of the inside of the dome of the Parthenon. It becomes the lens of a folding camera, like the one that Man Ray used so often. But it's floating in the sky in the same way that Man Ray suspended Lee's lips. If you turn it sideways, you can see the bellows of the camera make the name Man Ray. It's like a carefully hidden code. Then he wrote homage, and if you break the syllables apart, you get mage, and that could be a French pun for man, the wise man. The whole thing suggests Man Ray's ability to pull light out of the sky and transform it like a magician. For a magician, he truly was. This is the Man Ray that I knew since I was a small child. He was then married to Juliet. He was wise, kind, and owlish in the kind of way that owls are wise but know how to be fierce when they need to. He knew a lot about many different things. He was always making puns, mostly in French, sometimes in English, and he was always inventing things. This was his idea for a fly swat. There's a length of elastic here, and he pings it at the flies. He and I competed, and we got into terrible trouble because the walls of the house were covered with splatted flies. My dad, Roland Penrose, met Man Ray in Paris in the early 20s. Roland had gone to Paris to become a painter in 1922. He married the French poet, Valentine Bouet. She was beautiful, talented, and was already well known to the surrealists, Paul Éluard and André Breton. And it was she who introduced Roland to the surrealist movement and its artists. Man Ray and Roland became firm friends. They were both foreigners in Paris, escapees from repressive regimes in their homelands, and bonded by the value the surrealists placed on peace, freedom, and justice. Although Man Ray does not appear in the lineup of the opening day, he was very supportive to Roland Penrose when Roland curated the 1936 Surrealist exhibition in London, because Roland had returned from Paris as the ambassador of Surrealism, because Surrealism was virtually unknown in London. Here is Salvador Dali, Paul Eluard, his wife Noosh. There's Roland. This is Herbert Reed, the British art critic. That's Edouard Mezens, the Belgian picture dealer, and Eileen Agar. You might meet her again later. It opened in June 1936, and this was the moment that Roland first met the spirit of Lee Miller, because Man Ray had loaned l'Observatoire to the show. Of course, I'm sure that Roland had no idea what lay in store for him about a year later. That same year, Roland and Valentine holidayed together in Mougins on the Mediterranean coast of France. It was a wonderful gathering of surrealists. Here's Noosh Eluard, there's Valentine, here's Paul and his daughter Cécile by Gala, here's Picasso and Man Ray. Man Ray made a movie. He called it La Garoupe. The jollity covers a looming crisis in the life of Roland and Valentine, because it was only a temporary rapprochement between them. And after 11 years of marriage, they'd been forced to recognize they were on diverging paths. And later that year, Valentine and Roland parted, and she went to live in India. In 1937, Roland wanted to paint her for the last time, but of course she had gone. But fortunately, Man Ray had made this fabulous portrait, and Roland used that as source material, first of all, for his preparatory drawing, and later for one of the most famous paintings of his whole work, called Winged Domino. The birds and the butterflies cluster around Valentine's face as an attestation of her closeness to nature. Her face is blue, the blue of infinity, the blue of distance. She has gone to have her journey towards nirvana in India. But around her neck, the rose, the metaphor for love. And you can see the rose is spiking into Valentine's tender skin. You see, Roland is saying, yes, there is no rose without thorns, and there's no love without pain. But that pain was soon to be relieved, because Roland in 1937, in the summer, June, went to Paris. He met his old chum, Max Ernst, and together they went to a fantastic party. Roland had not been there for very long when he said he experienced the sensation of being struck by lightning, because across the room he had met a gaze of a pair of piercingly blue eyes. He had met Lee Miller. He was never the same again. The following night, they landed up in bed in the same hotel room, and Roland and Lee's life was to change irrevocably from that moment. Lee Miller was born in Poughkeepsie, upstate New York, in 1907. Her dad was an engineer. Her mum was a nurse. There were two brothers, Eric and John. And Lee was really known for being the most incredible tomboy. In fact, mums who had respectable daughters wouldn't let them play with Lee. But as a young woman, Lee was wandering through Manhattan when, as you've heard from Philip, she stepped out in front of a truck. And the guy that saved her was Condé Nast. And Condé Nast immediately put her on the front cover of Vogue, March 1927. She was not yet 20 years old. And this brought her to the attention of Edward Steichen, chief photographer of Vogue. And Steichen found that Lee had the most perfect looks for the soigné evening dresses, for the sportswear, for the casual wear. And he made her into what we would today call a supermodel. Coast to coast, Vogue and Vanity Fair for the next 18 months. But ironically, it was this photograph by Steichen that brought that modeling career to a crash stop, because it became used, as you know, for the Kotex advertisement. And the way they worded the copy made it seem like Lee had actually personally endorsed the product when she had no idea that this is what the photograph was going to be used for. Well, nobody wanted the Kotex girl modeling their couture dresses. So Lee, in this moment, simply said, "Pooh to you," jumped on a liner, and set off for Paris. Indirectly, after a tour of Europe, she arrived in Paris with an introduction to this guy, Man Ray. It was Steichen who set her up, because Lee had at this moment evinced that she wanted to be a photographer. And who better to learn from than this guy, the most exciting photographer that has ever been? Well, we've heard already how she turned up at his studio. "I'm your new student." "No, you're not. I'm going to Biarritz for my holiday." "Yes, I know. I'm going with you." And I did. And from that moment on, they photographed each other, sometimes playfully, sometimes formally, because as a model, Lee brought to Man Ray the technique and the style that was so popular in America at that time, and she seamlessly welded it into the French couture, and it upped Man Ray's game as a fashion photographer incredibly. And of course, he loved her. And these photographs from that time are much more than the simple adoring of her beauty, because underneath was this volcanic passion. This is a page taken from Man Ray's notebook. His handwriting tumbles backwards and forwards, "Lee, Lee, Elizabeth Lee," across the mask-like face of Lee drawn in pencil. I found this after my mum had died. It was among her papers, and when I opened it, this photograph fell out. You'll see it in the show. It's slightly larger than life, and it was chilling when I looked at it closely, because on the lower eyelid, Man Ray has taken a very sharp pencil and with considerable pressure written his name, his signature on Lee's eyelid. There's something quite sadistic about taking a sharp pencil and writing your name on your lover's eyelid like that. We get some sense of why when we turn it over. The date is the day that Lee finally left Man Ray and returned to New York. But the key is in the last line. "I am always in reserve." Man Ray was a wonderful guy, but he had a colossal ego. And for him to relegate himself to being in reserve must have been a huge step down. Part of the cause of the tension, in fact not all of it, was Man Ray's jealousy. He so wanted to own, to possess, to dominate Lee. You see, the Surrealists had this wonderful idea, subverting normal convention, of free love. L'amour fou. It's a great shot, isn't it? We call it tit for hat. And what it shows you is that they all believed in being very free with each other. You see, the men thought this was a very good idea, but they didn't think the women should do the same thing. And of course, Lee was not going to have any hypocrisy in her life. So she said to Man Ray, "Okay, if it's good enough for you, it's damn well good enough for me." And she nearly drove him nuts because she went off and had all the affairs she wanted. And he got so angry and so jealous. And in his letters, you can see him writing, "You must arrange to live as my wife, married or not. I cannot see you in any other way." This is the guy who was a signatory to the Surrealist Manifesto, a guy who belonged to a movement that repudiated anything conventional. But they did work very closely. And despite his jealousy, Man Ray was extremely generous, extremely generous to Lee Miller. And he encouraged her in her photography. I don't know what camera she's holding there, but her camera of preference immediately became the Rolleiflex. She bought one of the first models ever made, and she started cruising around Montparnasse, taking the kind of pictures that became her hallmark. I call them found images. You will know the Surrealists loved the idea of the found object, things that you find by chance that contain the marvelous in the ordinary. Well, Lee did this photographically. She just found things that had something about them marvelous in them. And you'll find this runs right through her work, whether she is combat photography or fashion. It's there, the found image. There were other images, other influences apart from Man Ray. I think maybe you might recognize some of Edward Weston's work here. And maybe Paul Strand came creeping in here too. But one influence that was undoubted was this wonderfully dotty, totally bonkers woman called Claude Cahun, a surrealist who lived in the Channel Islands. And Lee saw this photograph by Cahun. She's placed her own head underneath this glass dome. You know these domes, you see them in museums. They contain trophies, beautiful things that have been captured and put there as trophies. There's a wonderful metaphor in here, and Lee immediately became drawn into the idea. You see, as a beautiful woman, she was surrounded by people who wanted to capture her and turn her into a trophy. She got her friend Tanja Ram to pose under a glass dome. Tanja was a very beautiful woman who was a model for Mamboche at the time. And Man Ray shared the session. And his version shows Tanja wearing a blindfold that thus even more reduces her to a helpless captive. This beautiful thing that he's captured, made into a possession, showing off as a trophy under his glass jar. Sometime later, Man Ray recycled the image into this painting, Aline et Velcourt. There is the helpless woman captive. And here, the man, smug, self-satisfied, gloating over his trophy. One of Man Ray's photographs of Lee, he titled Suicide. It's about 1930. 7 years later, Paul Éluard invited Man Ray to contribute drawings to a book called Les Mains Libres. It was a book of Paul's poems, and this one was called Suicide, or Useless Death. We can see the knife or the dagger, and maybe that's a suicide note. But what's more important is, look at the shadow. It's anamorphic writing. If you look carefully, you will see M-A-N-R-A-Y, 1937. The only way to really see this is to go and look at the edge of the screen, because then it turns into that, Man Ray. But the metaphor here is quite fantastic. Lee has been gone from Man Ray's life for 5 years, yet do you think he is still regarding himself as being in her shadow after all that time? Interesting, isn't it? Actually, that anamorphic writing appeared many years later. In 1966, this is how he signed Lee and Roland's visitors book at Farley Farm. And of course, you have to tilt that edge on to make sense of it. Well, in their time together, Lee and Man Ray worked very, very closely. And of course, you will know that they were responsible for the reinvention, the reuse of the Sabatier effect, which they called solarization. And it did really begin when Lee was developing a negative, not actually this one, but one very like it. She had to dish develop it because it was a plate negative. And you do that in a little flat dish covered up with developer, and you have to do it in total darkness, and you rock the dish to distribute the developer. And you do it slowly and carefully. And while Lee was doing this, it is true, a rat ran over her foot. She yelled out and screamed and turned on the light. You do not turn on the light when you are dish developing negatives. So Man Ray immediately snapped off the light, dumped the negative in the fixer, and was astonished to find the effect that had been produced. The black background had reversed out into this gray. Around the edge, there's this extraordinarily beautiful line, this kind of reverse halation, this dark line. Some of the tones have reversed from positive to negative, so we have this wonderful surreal quality of negative and positive in the same shot. But it's not a good picture, is it? Look, there's a lot of not much happening going on here, and we've got this clunky great hand down in the bottom. Actually, this is entirely deliberate, because Man Ray's technique was to shoot wide and crop tight, and this is the version you will know, and how powerful it has become through being cropped. Well, solarization became the kind of hallmark of their association. They both used it frequently. Here is Lee's version of who we believe to be Meret Oppenheim. Attribution of Lee's work to Man Ray was quite widespread, because Lee often took fashion assignments over for Man Ray and other assignments too, to give him more time for doing his painting. And she said that she was not bothered when her photographs were published attributed to Man Ray. He wasn't bothered either. But there was one time when he did acknowledge her, and that was after their collaboration on the folio of rayographs called Électricité. He made this for the Electricity Company of Paris. And when he gave Lee her copy, he made this rather touching dedication in the folder. But there was one time when they really fell out in a really violent way over attribution, and that was due to this photograph. Man Ray took the original negative. He was disappointed in it. He threw it away. Lee fished the negative out of the trash and started working on it. She took it through several states of contrast, but actually it was cropping that fixed it. Shoot wide, crop tight. And this is the version she took to show Man Ray. What do you think of this? Wow. And then the fight started. Whose picture was it? Was it Man Ray's because he shot the original negative, or was it Lee's because she rescued the negative and made this print? Huge fight. Lee was thrown out of the studio. When she went back 4 days later, she found that Man Ray had nailed a copy of the photograph to the studio wall. He had slashed the neck with a razor, and red ink streamed down from the cut. Sometime later, Man Ray made this painting. He called it Logis d'artiste, the artist's abode, the artist's home. It's like peeping in through a window, and the first thing that we see is the big red hand. It's an object that Man Ray created. He loved making things that had hands or drawing pictures of hands because in French the word for hand is main, and it was like a pun on his own name, Man Ray. It was like he was asserting that he was foremost in the frame here. In the background, we've got that circular motif, and I couldn't figure out what this was for a very long time, and then Philip found out that it was actually a tambourine decorated with the Kyrgyz symbol for a ram's head. How, why, I don't know, but that's what it is. And you can see the stairs going up to the first floor, which are also evident in the painting. Then in the painting you'll find Imak Bakia. And Man Ray had a lot of necks from violins and cellos in his work. You will see them in his fashion photography and pack shots. So here we have the wooden neck of the cello harmonizing with Lee's neck, vulnerable, the skin stretched taut, the slash from the razor still evident, but now the blood has become blue. What I believe he's doing here is actually far more revealing than perhaps he intended it to be, because he's placed Lee with that vulnerability in his studio among his possessions. It's like finally he's immobilized her and got to own her. And owning Lee was very important for him. This is one of his favorite photographs of her. Actually, when we look at the original, it's one of a triptych, and she's allowed to have a head. And when we see all of these images, there's a beautiful lyrical tenderness. It's a lover looking at his loved one tenderly. But this is the version that he wanted us to see, because by now he's slashed off her head. He's removed her possibility for intelligence and for talking back to him. She's a mute, inanimate object, beautiful, capable of giving him erotic thrills, but never talking back. Julian very adroitly placed that photograph next to this beautiful painting by Man Ray, which he called Torso, 1929. It's as though perhaps the shadow pattern has inspired him to make the squiggly pattern on the torso. Interestingly enough, Man Ray to Roland, 1929. How is it that Man and Roland were so close, yet Roland did not meet Lee Miller for another 8 years? That Dada idea of the squiggles stayed with Man Ray. And when he went to the United States, it's said that he felt so homesick for Europe that he started to recreate some of his Dada images. And he made this in 1942. In 1946, Lee Miller arrived in Los Angeles and he gave it to her. And on the back, he wrote, "My visiting card to Lee." Maybe in that moment, he thought back to the torso. In that moment, he thought back to the origin of the squiggly pattern. But by now, back in Paris, Lee was thoroughly fed up with being turned into an erotic commodity. And the tipping point came when a manufacturer of glassware announced to the world in general that he had designed the shape of his newest champagne glass modeled on the shape of Lee Miller's breast. That was it. One of the ways that Lee earned her living was doing technical photography, and about that time she was photographing a radical mastectomy. When the operation was over, she asked the surgeon for the breast, which she carried through the streets of Paris on a plate covered with a cloth. She was heading for Vogue Studios, and when she got there, she put the plate on a napkin with a knife and a fork, and she just got off 2 shots before Hoyningen Hune, the studio boss, had a screaming fit and threw her and the breast out in the street. What on earth do you think was on her mind? Well, I don't know for sure, but I'll tell you what I think she was thinking. I think she was thinking, okay, men, you like my breasts. You're always looking at them. Well, here, have one. Eat it if you want. Because when you're looking at me, you forget that actually behind those breasts, there's a woman with a heart and a mind and a soul. Yeah. What better place to make that statement than Vogue Studios? Right now, under Man Ray's life, there was another volcanic eruption brewing. And it was because of this guy, somebody that Man Ray had known for a long time, was a collaborator with Jean Cocteau. Now, Cocteau was about as gay as you can get, so it wasn't going to be a love affair with Lee. No, what happened was that Cocteau used Man Ray's patrons, the Vicomte and Vicomtesse de Noailles, to make a film called The Blood of a Poet. And he cast Lee in the leading role as the statue who comes to life and kills the poet. Revenge. But Man Ray wanted revenge too. And in this moment, I believe, is when he originated the idea of one of the most famous objects in his entire work. He wrote a poem that goes, "Cut out the eye from a portrait of one who has been loved but is seen no more. Attach the eye to the pendulum of a metronome and regulate the weight to suit the tempo desired. Keep going to the limit of endurance with a hammer well aimed. Try to destroy the whole with a single blow." Man Ray titled it, "Object to be Destroyed." Lee said it was like having a wax effigy to stick pins into, and she had some reason for saying that because, of course, it was her face behind the eye. Finally, October 1932, Lee responded to an invitation from Condé Nast and went back to New York to become a photographer in his own right. I know what happened on that night because I met Jacqueline Goddard, and she was there. She described how Man Ray stood underneath the window of Lee's former studios and howled in the rain like a demented wolf. Finally, she persuaded him to come back to the studio. He was soaked to the skin, so he took his shirt off. And then, to Jacqueline's consternation, he positioned her beside the camera. He took out a gun. It was a real gun. She was afraid he really was going to shoot himself, but actually it was a spoof. Look in the muzzle of the gun. He's put a cigarette, like the still smoking gun. The clock does read the right time. It's 5:05 in the morning. It had been a long night for Man Ray and for Jacqueline. But Man Ray's final expiation of his grief at losing Lee was painting this picture. It took him 2 years to paint. It's big, It's 2 meters, that's more than 6 feet wide. And it has 2 titles. One title is L'heure de l'observatoire, observatory time, because this is the observatory of Montparnasse, which was a big landmark on the skyline near Man Ray's studio. It's also perhaps a hint that the astronomers are going to see something very strange in the sky soon. But the other title is Les Amoureux, the lovers. The lips morph into the closely entwined form of 2 lovers, and of course they are Lee's lips enlarged from this photograph. But the absolute genius of this painting is the way he's realigned the axis of the lips. That enables them to tilt, to fly freely in the early morning sky above Paris. This was his goodbye kiss. It was the moment that he forgave her, so that when he met her again 5 years later, that was when they restarted where they'd left off, but in a different kind of love. Meanwhile, back in New York, Lee established her studio, and in the teeth of the Depression, she became very successful. You see, she had that Parisian chic that again went over so well for the pack shots for advertising. And then the portrait clients arrived, Mary Taylor and Lillian Harvey. These women were actresses on Broadway who wanted arresting images to send to Hollywood casting directors. The studio was an unparalleled success. But then, in the summer of 1933, suddenly this guy appeared. His name was Aziz Eloui Bey. Lee had met him back in Paris because in that moment he was married to this woman, Nimet. And Man Ray and Hoyningen-Huene classified Nimet as one of the 7 most beautiful women of her day, and Lee was another of those 7. And Lee photographed Nimet. When she questioned Aziz about Nimet's beauty, he said, "That's no surprise. She spends all day painting her face." And from that remark, you will realize that all was not well in that marriage. And when Aziz arrived in New York, he had divorced Nimet, and now Lee, head over heels, at an impulse, married him and went back to live in Cairo. And for a while she was very happy in the easy life of an expatriate married to a wealthy Egyptian. But very soon she was bored witless by the inane conversation of the people that surrounded her. So she grabbed her Rolleiflex camera and she headed off into the desert, doing long-range excursions. They took her to the monasteries of Wadi Natrun, breasts again. Sensual breast-like domes made doubly ironic by the fact that they are occupied by celibate Coptic monks. Way off into the western desert, she made one of the most important photographs of her life, Portrait of Space, an image of escape, an image of longing for freedom, tearing through that veil, disappearing down the road, conscious of the portrait that frames nothing but space. For that is her gift to you, a space to populate with your dreams and your imaginations. But not even desert travel was enough to really satisfy Lee. She longed for returning to Paris, and Aziz, ever indulgent, bought her an air ticket. And the night she arrived in Paris, she went to that crazy party, and that was the moment she met this quiet, tweedy Englishman, Roland Penrose, already known as a surrealist in Paris, already a friend of Man Ray's. And Roland invited Lee and Man Ray down to the south of Cornwall for a holiday. And Man Ray brought with him this lovely young woman. In the 5 years that had passed since he had last seen Lee, Man Ray had not really had an important woman in his life, and now he had, and her name was Adi Fideline. She came from Martinique, and everyone loved her. She was warm, ebullient, and seriously uncomplicated. She fitted in perfectly with the other surrealists. Here is Leonora Carrington. Here is Noosh Eluard. And after a few weeks of enchantment in Cornwall, they all went to the south of France, to Mougins on the Mediterranean coast. And there, Lee took this famous photograph. We call it Picnic. Here is Paul Eluard and Noosh. Here is Man Ray and Adi And here in the middle, well, that's what a tweedy, uptight Englishman looks like when he's found the woman of his dreams and he's living with her in the south of France. Man Ray recorded the event like this. It's called To Roland, 4 Women and Your Servant. I believe this is Lee. You see how her neck is turned away, redolent of that neck photograph. This, I believe, is Noosh Eluard. And here, well, I think that's Eileen Agar. And undoubtedly, that is Adi, I'm sure. Well, there should have been 2 other people there at that marvelous picnic, Picasso and Dora Maar. But that morning they'd had a furious row, so they stayed behind to cool off. And Picasso immediately took a serious interest in Lee. He set up a studio in his hotel room, and he painted Lee 6 times. This is how she looked, 10 years on from being a supermodel for Condé Nast. And this is how Picasso painted her. Do you think she's looking sad? Do you think she might be crying? Maybe that letter contains some bad news. Well, just a few weeks before coming to the south of France, Picasso had finished painting Guernica. His outrage at the bombing of the little town in the Basque country of Spain, where 3,000 people were killed and injured by airplanes lent to General Franco by Hitler and Mussolini. The war was minutes away. But Picasso, like many Spaniards, had the capacity to put great grief in one hand and great joy in the other and hold them tightly together. And in this moment, he painted Lee Miller 6 times, à la Arlésienne, like a woman from Arles, because the women from Arles are known for being particularly beautiful. And Picasso wanted to make that compliment to Lee. My dad bought this one, and he gave it to my mum as a present, and when I grew up, it hung in our home, and it was the most embarrassing thing that you can imagine, because my school chums would come home and they would gawp at it. And by now they had heard that my mum had had her portrait painted by a very famous artist, and they would look at this and they'd say, "Gaw, your mum really looked like that. What happened?" Well, it took me a long time to decode this painting. Look at the yellow face. That's Picasso's metaphor for the warmth of Lee's personality and the brilliance of her intellect. He's given her a sunshine yellow for both of those qualities. But there are other things. Look at her chest. Do you see that triangular figure? Do you think that's Man Ray's metronome? You see, Picasso knew Man Ray's work. He also knew how Lee had driven Man Ray to the edge of insanity. And he was a kleptomaniac when it came to stealing ideas from other artists. Look at this. Look at her genital area. Do you think that reminds you of anything? Yes. Well, actually, this series of portraits as a kid did not still mean much for me until I found that if I took a profile shot of Lee and I drew round it, it fitted her face almost exactly. Doesn't quite fit round the chin, does it? No, that's because, you see, she's got her mouth open, making that great big gap-toothed grin. Check the grin. See what I mean? Yeah. Isn't it amazing how underneath all that distortion, we have these really true observations? Well, Lee went back to Aziz. She stayed there until 1939, when Roland decided he could no longer live life without her. Aziz knew Lee was unhappy. When he met Roland, he realized that here was a man who could take care of her as well as he could. He gave her a boat ride ticket. He gave her money. He gave her his love for the rest of his life. And she set off for England. Almost immediately, they left for Europe. They met up with Man Ray and Adi. And they went to find Max Ernst and Leonora Carrington. They were heading south for Provence. They were heading for Antibes, where they were going to meet up with Picasso. In this moment, everyone knew the war was literally minutes away. And perhaps that what prompted Man Ray to give Lee some drawings. This is one of them. It's tiny. If you want to know how it works, you find a naked woman You close one eye and you look sideways across the bridge of your nose out of the other eye, but you have to be smoking a cigarette to make it work. He gave her this drawing, La Couture, quite a cynical take on fashion, and Belles Mains. The drawings were made some years earlier, 1937, but they're dedicated to Lee, gifted to her in 1939. Perhaps Man Ray knew the war was closing in, and he wanted to get these drawings away to somewhere safe. Back in England, Lee started work almost immediately as a freelancer with Vogue Studios, but she was bored with fashion very quickly. So she took her Rolleiflex out in the street, photographing the damage done by the bombs. But there was always humor. She called this exceptional achievement. And this one was called Remington Silent. 1942, America entered the war, and this allowed Lee to become a war correspondent because the Brits wouldn't have women correspondents, but the Americans did. And they gave Lee a pass card that allowed her to go onto military bases. And straight away, she was photographing the women at war, ATS searchlight operators, Wren torpedo mechanics, women ferry pilots, women doing the most incredibly responsible, difficult, and often dangerous jobs. And then the Normandy landings came, and soon after, Lee went ashore back of Omaha Beach at La Cambre. She was covering the activities of a field hospital, but she went right up close to the medical clearing stations behind the front line. Her article, published in Vogue, proved her domination of Vogue features for the next 18 months. But Lee just wanted to be out the front and moving forwards, and that took her to the siege of St. Malo. She was the only reporter for miles around. She scooped the siege that lasted 8 days. This is one of the first ever napalm attacks, as the US 83rd dislodged the German defenders from the port of St. Malo. But Lee did not have time to rest on the laurels of her scoop because the race for Paris was on, and she arrived on the first day of liberation. She described the streets as filled with screaming, cheering, pretty people. She found her way straight away to Picasso's studio. He hugged her. He kissed her all over. And then he stood back and he said, "C'est incroyable." It's incredible. The first Allied soldier I should see is a woman, and she is you. That has to be a Cyril moment in his life. But not even Picasso could keep Lee in Paris in the winter of 44-45 because some of the toughest fighting of the whole war was taking place in the Vosges and Alsace, and Lee was there. And she was there when finally the Allies punched through into Germany. She was on their heels as they crossed the country. Frankfurt, the bridges blown. Cologne, the oldest cathedral in Europe, nearly reduced to rubble. And the concentration camps, 4 of them, Ohrdruf, Penning, Buchenwald, and Dachau, where she arrived on the morning after the liberation of the night before. Nothing she had experienced before could have prepared her for these horrors. She had been under fire for 30 days, but how could anyone come to terms with what she saw in these places? When she got through to Paris, the war became very, very personal to her because so many of her friends were missing. Mostly her Jewish friends had gone, but anyone the Nazis regarded as a dissident. That meant journalists, teachers, writers, printers, poets. They'd gone. And as Lee was going around Dachau and other places like it, she was looking into the faces of the dead and the dying to see if any of her missing friends were among them. And you can believe these images stayed seared into her memory for the rest of her life. But that night, she and her buddy David Sherman had the most incredibly exclusive billet. It was the only apartment in Munich that had hot water. And Lee jumped in to the tub. Sherman and she suddenly realized they had one of the scoops of the century because it was Hitler's apartment and she was in Hitler's tub. They grabbed a photograph and they stuck it on the edge, photographed by Heinrich Hoffmann of Hitler in full regalia. That was to sort of say that was where they were. But that is not the key piece of this photograph. The key piece is the boots, because the morning of this day, those boots had carried Lee Miller around Dachau, and now she is stamping the filth of that place into Hitler's nice, clean bath mat. In this moment, unknown to Lee and her buddy Sherman, across Germany, Hitler and Eva Braun were busy killing themselves, and in this moment a huge circle was closed that signaled the end of the war. But Lee did not return home immediately. She went way into Eastern Europe, and when she did come home, Vogue immediately celebrated her achievements and made her into kind of a celebrity status. She was filmed by Pathé News, and they sent her over to New York to make a big deal with Condé Nast America. And when that was all over, she and my dad went to Arizona to find Max Ernst and his new love, Dorothea Tamming, who were living in Sedona. And then they flew to Los Angeles because they knew that Man Ray was there, living in Hollywood, in Vine Street, and it was the most fantastic reunion. Man Ray had heard that Lee had become a soldier, and he expected to hear that she had strangled Hitler with her bare hands. Of course, Lee and Roland and Man Ray had so much to talk about, so many threads to pick up. You see, Man Ray had left Paris, left France in 1940, and managed to get out and come to the United States. Addie had not been able to come with him. She was French, from Martinique. She couldn't get an exit visa, and the separation killed that love. But at this time, Man Ray had been in love with Juliet Browner for some time. Juliet had been a dancer with the Martha Graham, and she was also a brilliant chess player, and she and Man Ray were very much in love. In fact, a few weeks after Lee and Roland left Los Angeles, Juliet and Man Ray, Max Ernst and Dorothea, had a joint wedding. Man Ray said that he could not imagine doing anything quite so rectangular. I'm not sure what he meant, but it can't have been bad because they stayed together right up until Man Ray died. But after all this, the demons began to set in. Those images seared into Lee Miller's memory would not quit. There is no erase button when you have seen horrors. She sank into what we would today understand as post-traumatic stress disorder. In those days, there was no understanding. We just had the stiff upper lip and a lot of whiskey. She became depressed. She became alcohol dependent. And then I came along and gave her a really good dose of postnatal depression, too. My parents got married just before I was born. And in 1949, we went to live in this old farmhouse in Sussex, Farley Farmhouse. My dad thought it would be good for her living in the countryside, but she said, "Fuck living in the countryside. There's no shops here." But actually, she made it into a good home. And it was the meeting place for a great many people. One of our first visitors was Picasso. He came in 1950, and he and I made instant friends. And it is indeed true, I did bite him. And he, yeah, it is true, I have to admit. And he bit me right back. And that is a whole different story, which you can read about in my book, The Boy Who Bit Picasso, available from all good bookshops. Soon after the war, Man Ray and Juliet returned to Paris, and they resumed their close connection with my parents. And Man Ray was a frequent visitor to Farley Farm. After one of his visits in 1955, he sent this wonderful thank you note to Lee and Roland, filled with photographs that he had taken on his visit. They recorded gently and humorously the things they'd experienced. Here, Guy Fawkes, the guy that we burn on November the 5th, sits next to the figurehead of a ship. Man Ray noted, only as if they did not wish to know of their falling in love with one another. Why did not we dance? The end. It wasn't the end. Man Ray was so close to my parents, and I grew up in a house that was filled with all kinds of his treasures. You can see the metronome here. You can see here the bubble pipe. Ceci qui manque à nous tous, that we all lack. What do you think he was talking about? I couldn't nut this out for a long time until I found this photograph of Lee. He made the bubble pipe version, that one, soon after she had gone. And I believe what he's saying, what we all lack, is that moment of bliss, that joy, that love, that erotic wonderfulness that's gone, like the bubble, never to be replaced. In the Man Ray works around the house, I began to have games finding his signatures hidden. Here in the chessboard, it's called Knight's Tour, but actually you will find, if you look carefully, M-A-N-R-A-Y. Man Ray always put himself in the middle of his own dramas, and of course chess is all about drama and conflict. This is the chessboard that he made. The pieces are absolutely wonderful. They're turned out of aluminum and anodized. The knight's head is 1/6 of a perfectly shaped disc that gives us the horse's face and its arched neck. The queen, a cone, like those pointy hats that medieval queens wear. And the king, a pyramid, a bit pharaonic. And if you look carefully at the base, you'll find that Man Ray has written Man Ray, the king. There's no question in his mind where he belongs on the chessboard. He gave this to my mum to cheer her up. He had no understanding of post-traumatic stress and all that kind of stuff, but he knew she was sad. For Lee, this consoler, if she needs one, look here. Well, here is a little lens like you have on a door. It gives you a fisheye view. You see, perhaps he was saying, okay, if you don't like the way you see the world, look at it differently. In my dad's study was this, cadeau. Man Ray originally made it as a present for Eric Satie. I don't think Mrs. Satie did much ironing. Well, I was inspired by Man Ray, and this was one of my very first objects that I made. It's a piece of farm machinery. It's the tine off the mower in the front of a reaper and binder. I gave her a pair of gorgeous breasts because I thought she looked like a girl in an evening dress. Man Ray liked it, so I made another. Well, there were many pieces like this on the machine, so I just unscrewed another one, and I made one for him. And he took it away. And a few years ago, a friend of mine found this photograph of the inside of Man Ray's studio, and there on the top shelf is my girl in the evening dress. I felt so thrilled that he had seen fit to take it back and put it among his objects in his studio. As a teenager, I often visited Man Ray, and on one occasion I took my chum with me, Andrew Lanyon, a very, very budding photographer, an enormously talented guy. Man Ray agreed to pose for a photograph. I had the idea of holding the chessboard behind his head, and this is the shot that Andrew took. He sent a copy to Man Ray. Man Ray wrote back, "This is the portrait of me I like the most." That was to a 17-year-old school kid. What an incredible, generous piece of encouragement that was. This is what Andrew looks like today. And he and I collaborated together to make an exhibition of the way in which we had been inspired by surrealists in our childhood. And we drew from the collection of Falmouth Art Gallery where the exhibition was to be. And one of Andrew's objects was clearly inspired by cadeau, and so was another. And I was rather distressed by the way the pins on Andrew's iron were falling off. So I made him one like this, where the pins were certainly not going to fall off in a big hurry. And then, continuing the riff, I made this, which I titled Modern Man. Of course, it had to go on from there. And I threw a modern iron into a very hot furnace, and when I raked out the ashes, it had melted. So I called that Cadeau de Dali, because Dali was always making melted watches and things like that. My dad, in 1975, organized the big Man Ray exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, and this was the moment his biography of Man Ray was published. Man Ray signed the book for me and my late wife, Susanna, and then Roland added the color and his own modest dedication. I find the pink motif very striking. It reminds me of Les Amoureux. Or perhaps it combines the eye from the metronome. You decide. But a French curator once said to me, the shortest path between two men is a woman. And it's very clear that that was how it was with Man Ray and Roland. Man Ray continued to live at 2 bis Rue Ferrou for the rest of his life. He lived there with Juliette, and he was always so glad to see my parents when they called on him. Man Ray died in 1976, and his parting took a huge chunk out of all of our lives. But what we were not to know in that moment until a few months later was that Lee had just been diagnosed with terminal cancer. She lived just long enough to meet our firstborn daughter, Amy, before she died at Farley Farmhouse, July 1977, about a year after Man Ray. One of the things that I valued most about Man Ray was that whenever he came, Lee always looked so happy. You can see the way they're looking into each other's eyes. And from a very early age, that told me something really important that's been with me ever since, which is that love is a thing of the heart that lasts forever. And it's not just about looking good when you're young. And if you want any proof of that, go and find the very last exhibit in Philip and Julian's show and read the very last words on that letter. I love you. Can anyone here tell me if there's anything more important than that? Thank you.